Hey, back with Nihilism, Anarchy, 21st Century. Last video, I was only able to read about foundational nihilism, so this is going to be covering revolutionary nihilism and the last act of the Russian nihilists. So, looking at about like a 20-minute video, give or take. So yeah, Russian revolutionary nihilism. The entrance on the scene of one person symbolizes the transformation of the foundational period to the revolutionary period. Sergei Nietzsche, the son of a serf, which was unusual as most nihilists came from a slightly higher social class, which we would call lower middle class, desired an escalation of the discourse on social transformation. Nietzsche argued that just as the European monarchies used the ideas of Machiavelli and the Catholic Jesuits practiced absolute immorality to achieve their ends, there was no action that could not also be used for the sake of the people's revolution. His apparent immorality, more an amorality, derived from the cold realization that both church and state are ruthlessly immoral in their pursuit of total control. The struggle against which powers must therefore be carried out by any means necessary. Quoted by Cleaver. Nietzsche's social catch was greatly increased by his association with Bakunin in 1869 and extraction of funds from the Bakhmati Fund for Russian revolutionary propaganda. The image of Nietzsche is much a result of his Catechism of a Revolutionist, published 1869, as any actions he actually took in life. The Catechism is an important document as it establishes the clear break between the formation of nihilism as a political philosophy and what it becomes as a practice of revolutionary action. It documents the revolutionary as a very transformed figure from the nihilists of the past decade. Whereas the nihilists may have practiced asceticism, they argued for an uninhibited hedonism. Nietzsche argued that the revolutionary, by definition, must live devoted to one aim and not allow for distractions of desire, compassion, or feelings. Friendship was contingent on revolutionary fervor. Relationships with strangers was quantified in terms of what resources they offered revolution, and everyone had a role during the revolutionary movement that boiled down to how soon they would be lined up against the wall or when they would accept that they had to do the shooting. The uncompromising tone and content of the Catechism was influential far beyond the character of Nietzsche. Part of the reason for this is because of the way in which it extended nihilist principles into a revolutionary program. The rest of the reason was that it gave the revolutionary project a macho weightiness that the men of the 60s did not. In terms of what the Catechism offered nihilism, a quote, "By revolution, our organization does not mean a regulated pattern in the classical Western sense, a movement that always stops and bows with respect before private property rights and before traditions of public order and so-called civilization and morality. One which until now has limited itself to overthrowing one political form to replace it with another that tried to create a so-called revolutionary state. The only revolution that could be beneficial for the people would be that revolution which destroyed at its roots any elements of the state, which would exterminate all state traditions, social order, and classes in Russia." Nietzsche appears to be attempting to bridge the gap between Machiavelli and a nihilistic anarchism in this thesis, which, beyond anarchist hand-wringing to the contrary, is a sobering take on what horrors may be necessary for the abolition of the standing order. Which is not to say that there is much to reclaim from the personality of Nietzsche in general. The facts are clear. Nietzsche imagined a secret revolutionary organization, the Russian Revolutionary Committee, with himself as the fugitive member from which he was taking refuge in Geneva, where he met Bakunin. Bakunin, an admirer of Nietzsche's zeal and stories of his organization's success, provided contacts and resources to send Nietzsche back to Russia as his representative. He gave him the number 2771 of the Russian section of the World Revolutionary Lines, also an imaginary organization. Upon his return to Russia, Nietzsche formed the secret cell-based organization People's Vengeance. One student member of the organization, Ivan Ivanich Ivanov, questioned the very existence of the secret revolutionary committee that Nietzsche claimed to be a representative of. The honest appraisal of Nietzsche's modus operandi required action. On the evening of November 21st, 1869, the victim was accordingly lured to the premise of the Moscow School of Agriculture, a hotbed of revolutionary sentiment, where Nietzsche did him to death by shooting and strangulation, assisted without great enthusiasm by 3 dupes. Nietzsche's accomplices were arrested and tried. Upon his return to Switzerland, Nietzsche was rejected by Bakunin for most of the obvious reasons, and was eventually extradited back to Russia, where he spent the remainder of his life at the Peter and Paul fortress. He did, due to his charisma and force of will, continue to influence events, maintaining a relationship to people's will and weaving even his jailers into his plots and lies. He was found dead in his cell in 1882 under mysterious circumstances. Among the revolutionary movement, nihilist or not, the post-Nietzschean period, there was a clear division. The split between the propagandists who followed Russian émigré Peter Lavrov, who published Forward in Paris, and what was called the Bakunists, who believed in pushing the peasants into immediate social revolution. The focus of both groups was on organizing the peasants. This included a Russian version of Freedom Summer, which actually stretched 2 years, 1873 and 1874. The second of which was coined Mad Summer, where young men and women in groups of 3 and 4 traveled to rural villages to live, work, and agitate amongst the peasants. This was inspired in large part by the belief that Russian institution of the village commune was the shortest path to Russian socialism. The commune was a self-governing body that managed some village affairs and made decisions collectively. The rural effort was a complete failure. The peasants often handed the nihilists over to the police before even getting a sense of what they were around for. The nihilists disguised themselves as peasants, with the unsurprising result of being entirely obvious from the moment they walked into a village. Furthermore, the concept of rural revolt was a historical in the least, as the peasants did not have the ability to arm themselves in a meaningful way and did not actually have a tradition of successful uprisings. The Russian, Ukrainian, and Cossack revolts in the 17th and 18th century were quickly suppressed. The only near success, which began before the nihilists arrived on the scene, was the Chingirian era on the river Dnieper near Kiev. In 1877, 3 revolutionaries, Stefanovich, Dush, and Bokhanovsky, traveled a charter purporting to come from the Tsar, calling on the peasants to take up arms, which they did, in the form of antiquated pikes, other farming equipment, and a body of peasants 1,000 strong. Hundreds of peasants were arrested and sent to Siberia, and the 3 nihilists were imprisoned in the Kiev Gaol, which became known as the Chingirian Affair. A preliminary note on the role of women in the nihilist organization is in order. While given their tenuous social gains under Alexander II, women were less easily convincible to join the project of dismantling society. Once engaged, were, if anything, more committed to action, violence, and seeing the project through than their male counterparts. This is best exemplified by the direct taking up of arms during the revolutionary period, beginning with the action of one woman, Vera Zasulich. Once taking up of arms and the formation of secret societies was in full swing, women took no small part in the proceedings. An accounting in the People's Will, the most famous of the nihilist secret societies, states that 1/4 to 1/3 of the organization were women. Nearly half of the executive committee were women, while the social mores of the culture that the nihilists came from were not entirely upset, which meant that there's still women's work, namely housework and typesetting. On the whole, women had egalitarian relationships with men. There were many secret societies formed in the revolutionary period. Two of them, the Trogdolites and the Revolutionary Populist Group of the North, eventually settled into forming the second iteration of Land and Freedom in 1876, although the name was not settled until 1878. This group resolved itself as firmly in the Bakunis camp in reaction to the failures of their world campaigns of the years past. The notable events of the 70s originated in this action. In December of 1876, there was a political demonstration in the square of Our Lady of Kazan in St. Petersburg. The police broke up the meetings. They arrested and convicted to 15 years of prison a latecomer to the protests, a known revolutionary named Bogloyubov. He then, in an unexplainable act of intransigence, refused to take off his cap for the visiting General Trepov, who was reviewing the prison he shared with the political prisoners of the trial of 193. The infuriated general beat him on the spot and demanded he be flogged the next day, which was done with such vigor that Boglubov went mad. This resulted in a prison riot. Bars of cell windows were torn off and beaten against the doors, and prisoners were repeatedly tied up by wardens, beaten, kicked, and hauled unconscious to the punishment cells. Outside the prison, Trepov's act created widespread indignation, by no means confined to professed revolutionaries. A Russian gentleman's honor was especially sensitive, where the striking of blows was involved, and so Boguslav's punishment was taken as a monstrous affront to the whole revolutionary movement, staffed as it very largely was by young people who regained social pretensions. Vera Zasulich was not personally acquainted with the principal actors, but took it upon herself to take action. She sought an audience with the general in a reception room of Russian officials, where she drew a revolver from her muff, fired, and killed him. In an unexpected move, the regime allowed for Zasulich to be tried by a jury, assuming that because she confessed to the act, that they had the weapon and there were witnesses. That result was guaranteed. Instead, the jury acquitted her, and upon leaving the courthouse, where the police awaited her for additional arrests, a small riot occurred, resulting in her being whisked away by her comrades. This act, and the accompanying scandal, launched a 7-year wave of action from the Nihilists against agents of the state, and attempts mostly failed at repression by the state. In January of 1878, the Odessa police raided the printing press of Ivan Kowalski, who defended himself and his press with a revolver and dagger, thereby creating a tradition of nihilists fighting it out till the end with police. While his comrades burnt incriminating documents and attempted to incite a crowd gathered around for the spectacle, Kowalski was eventually captured, tried, and put to death as the first Russian political execution of the time. On the 1st of February, 1878, a police infiltrator was killed by revolutionaries, and a note informing the public that the execution was posted in Kiev, bearing the seal of the Executive Committee of Russian Socialist Revolutionary Party, an imaginary organization. On the 23rd of February, Valerian Osinski, a nihilist from the south, shot the public executor of Kiev twice. The victim was unhurt, perhaps due to the thickness of his fur coat. On May 25th, Gregory Popko stabbed to death Captain Gayking of the Kiev Gendarmerie on a corner of Nain through the city, then escaped by fatally shooting a doorkeeper who tried to stop him and wounding a policeman. Michael Frolenko, a southern nihilist, became an employee of the impregnable Kiev Gaul and quickly rose to the rank of chief warden. On May 27th, he walked Stefanovich, Dusht, and Bolkanvalsky of the Chingirin affair out of the prison walls, where they spent a week on the Dnieper River rowing to safety. The northern Nihilists began catching up to the exploits of the southerns in August. At 9 o'clock in the morning, on one of the main streets, St. Petersburg, Sergei Kravchinsky walked towards General Mezentov, chief of Gendarmes and head of the 3rd Section, who was on his way to office. Kravchinsky held a dagger lightly wrapped in newspaper, and after passing the general, he thrust in his back and twisted it, then leaped into a carriage drawn by Barbarian, a famous trotter, and escaped. This was particularly notable because it happened 2 days after the execution of Kowalski by the state. February 9th of 1879 was the date of the shooting of the Governor-General Dmitry Kropotkin in Kharkov, cousin to Peter Kropotkin, by Gregory Goldenberg. Also in February of that year was the death of another police infiltrator and another gun battle with the police in Kiev. April 2nd was the attempted assassination of the Tsar by Alexander Soliovol, who fired and missed 5 times, the Tsar suffering nothing more than a hole in his outer coat. Soliovol was hanged on May 28th. So the repression of the next 8 months was severe, with 16 Nihilists being hanged throughout Russia, including the 14 in the region of Kiev. Remarkably, the only 3 Nihilists, Popko, Kravchinsky, and Goldenberg, who actually killed people, escaped the scaffold. Popko escaped, Kravchinsky escaped to London to be run over by a train, and Goldenberg hung himself after confessing his crimes to a fellow revolutionary, who was actually a police agent. On the 20th of February, 1880, a Nihilist named Mayodesky took a shot at one of the 2 governor-generals in charge of the repression. Governor-General Loris Melikov. Once again, he missed his shot and was executed 2 days later. Nihilists made up in enthusiasm what they lacked in marksmanship. The repression of the state raised the question in stark terms as to how effective the current strategy of land and freedom was. In 1879, a conference was held to evaluate the methods of violence used by the group. This resulted in the dissolution of Land and Freedom and created a black repartition, which held that militant propaganda was the appropriate method for moving forward, and the people's will, which condemned the Tsar to death. Black repartition exists in the stage as they leave the arena of direct contestation with the state, but they are of note as the location of George Plekhanov, the most notable Marxist of the time and up to the period of 1905. Before the exposition of the final act of Russian nihilist play, it is worthwhile to take pause. Beyond just assassination plots and reading literature, the Nihilists were engaged in what they believed was a deep challenge to all aspects of Russian life. Along with atheism, non-monogamy, bank robbery, with several tunneling episodes to their credit, and forgery, especially of the passport documentation that served as the Russian primary identification papers, the Nihilists lived in communal apartments with people their own age, sharing resources and devoting their lives to the cause. The state made attempts to infiltrate the Nihilists. In return, the Nihilists also infiltrated the state. Their subterfuge of the Kiev Gaul has also been mentioned, but far more significant in the Nihilists by the name of Nicholas Kleshnikov, who actually infiltrated the secret police, feeding the Nihilists names of informers, locations of planned raids, and copies of official seals. The popularity of the secret society gave the Nihilists a degree of seriousness that doesn't exist in the more countercultural parallels to their lifestyle today, but the attempts at living both within and against the current order continues to be popular in the same way. And then we have the last act of Russian Nihilists. So, after the dissolution of Land and Freedom, the people's will devoted themselves to the assassinations of the Tsar. They did not see his death as linked to a larger social struggle. They did not have the infrastructure, social solution, or desire to assume power, and believed that the institution of the Russian autocracy was firmly in place. Their desire was not a coup, it was vengeance. The Nihilists also held on to the belief that if their positive actions towards social change, like the organizing of the peasants, were so easily thwarted, the malevolence of neglect by the state, then negative action, like assassination, would more likely result in substantive change in the system. Finally, there was a fatalist and deeply held belief that destruction was worthwhile for its own sake, and not because of humanitarian, political, or social reasons. After assessing the failures of Nihilist sharpshooters, the decision was made to attack the Tsar with demonstrations. In November of 1879, the Nihilists attempted to mine the train route that the Tsar would take from Levita onto the Crimean coast near Yalta to St. Petersburg at 3 different points. The first was made near Odessa, organized by Vera and involved the attempt to insert a nihilist into the position of the railway watchman, but when the Tsar took a different route, this plan was abandoned. The second happened just outside Alexandrovsk and involved an intricate plan of nihilist Andrei Zaglebov, 1850 to 1881, to portray the launching of a tannery business by day and to plant dynamite by night. When the train carrying the Tsar came through, the explosives refused to ignite. The final point was organized by Alexander Mikhailov near Moscow. It involved the renting of an apartment a mere 50 yards from the rail line, the digging of a tunnel from the apartment to the line, and the setting of the charge at the train line. Naturally, this plan sounds better on paper than in practice. The digging involved several more people than the neighbors believed lived in the apartment, which prompted the response to the queries about the household food consumption to be levied against a legendary cat and not a group of nihilists digging a tunnel to assassinate the Tsar. As with most tunnel digging, disposing of the dirt from the tunnel involved a system of dragging the dirt out of the tunnel into a spare bedroom and then scattered through the yard at night. Naturally, the land through which the tunnel lay was sandy and easily flooded, resulting in an entirely miserable experience. As they approached the tracks, the deafening sound of each passing train confirmed each digger's worst suspicion that they were about to be caved in upon. Naturally, the train containing the Tsar was not the one derailed by the firing of the explosive. Only casualty was the Tsar's jam from his Crimean estate. As no nihilist was captured and the explosion was a close call, there was a general consensus that this was the right approach. The next attempt was made at the Tsar's Winter Palace on the 5th of February, 1880. It involved the nihilists taking a job within the palace, smuggling amounts of dynamite into the cellar, and at the appropriate time igniting the explosive, taking out the guards' quarters in between. Once again, the timing of the action was off. The scheduled arrival of the Tsar was delayed, which meant that explosive went off prior to Alexander's arrival. 11 people were killed and 50 injured. The next attempt involved the submersion of 100 weight of explosive under the Kameny Bridge on the Catherine Canal, which the Tsar had to pass to travel to the train station, which was started by the tardiness of one of the conspirators. Another attempt began as the ambitious mining of the road that the Tsar would pass from the harbor to the train in Odessa. When the Tsar's travel plans changed, the effort was abandoned. The rest of 1880 found the nihilists concerned with tracking the traveling arrangements of the Tsar. They found that Sunday was the best day to strike, as the Tsar usually followed a singular route to and from the military reviewing grounds. It was on the corner of the Nevsky Prospect and Mala Sadovia Street where the nihilists would strike. This involved renting an apartment digging a tunnel and attempting to act like proper citizens. Their failure to convince the neighbors resulted in a raid on their premises by an inspecting party who did not happen to notice the piles of wet earth covered by straw and coke. On the 27th of February, Soliovol, the organizer of the operation, was arrested, which almost brought down the whole operation. After the Tsar reviewed the troops on March 1st, he visited his cousin, the Grand Duchess Catherine. This meant that he would not likely travel the intersection where the Nihilist plot was focused, and instead required the use of the small 5-pound homemade hand grenades that were prepared for such a possibility. 4 Nihilists put themselves into position. 2 were able to launch their bombs, the second catching both the Tsar and Ignaty Grivitsetsky, who threw the bomb, both of whom died. 5 members of the plot to assassinate the Tsar were ceremoniously hung on April the 3rd, wearing a placard stating Tsaricide. Those hung include Andrei Zelyabov, Nicholas Ryskov, Sofia Pervosky, Nikolai Kibalchich, and Timothy Miglayev. Their hanging was not by the dropping of the floor or the breaking of the necks, but the slow suffocation of those hung. The deaths took such a long time and were so public that the result was a loss of face for the regime. Thus ends the period of Russian nihilism. The heir to the throne of Russia, Alexander III, 1884 to 1894, was an autocrat in the old style, brutally suppressed any remaining nihilists who dared show themselves after the fall of the Tsar. He believed in ruling the empire by nationalism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and autocracy, which he was successful with until his death, at which time his son Nicholas II took to the throne to be toppled by the Russian Revolution of 1917. That nihilism has continued to be an overlooked branch by the socialist tree is surprising, even given the innovations of the movement. Beyond just the nihilist approach to social change, which has been clearly influential far beyond the socialist tradition, is the systematic way in which nihilists attempted to extend their ideas beyond just their politics. Given the repressive environment in which their ideas flourished, the breadth and scope of the Russian nihilists continued to bear fruit of committed individuals bridging the gap between theory and practice. That wraps up all of foundational nihilism and the history of that. So there is a bibliography that I will put in the description, and then we have what is left: nihilism versus socialism. So yeah, thanks for watching.